If I come across one more greedy, grumpy, beer-chugging, gold-hoarding dwarf, one more capricious, xenophobic, judgmental tree-hugging elf, or one more halfling constantly gobbling up food as he robs everyone blind, I think I might just cry a little bit. J.R.R. Tolkien was a master of the craft. There's a reason why he's widely acclaimed as the father of modern fantasy. I love The Silmarillion. It's probably my favorite work of fantasy fiction. That being said, there's a secondary effect to his greatness that has led to the poisoning of a great deal of fantasy fiction ever since. Hi, my name is Jonathan Oldenburg. I am the author of Tears from Iron, a fantasy epic set in the ruins of a world called Isfalinus. Alongside humans, there are three fantastical races that inhabit this world, one of whom plays a significant part in the story. As we dive deeper into the solutions for the second-hand Tolkien, I'll let you know which one I picked. But it's important to note that all three are completely viable good options depending upon your tastes and your intentions. So Tolkien has an inheritance problem. What do I mean? As I hinted at the beginning, these dwarves, elves, halflings, and so on have become a popular staple of modern fantasy, to such an extent that they've devolved into walking clichés and tropes that oftentimes leave the audience yearning for an original thought. The problem is that fantasy world builders, be they authors, game designers, or dabblers just for the fun of it, can find themselves just stuck between a rock and a hard place. Here's why. Have you heard the expression, a copy of a copy of a copy? That's essentially what we have going on here. Modern authors probably drew a lot of inspiration from the stories of their childhood. If you're a Gen Xer like me, that may mean authors like Raymond Feist and Tad Williams, who in turn drew upon Tolkien, who in turn drew upon the old myths and legends of Norse and Germanic past. If you're younger than me, then there's probably another generation or two of copying to add on to the end of that. And of course, I haven't even mentioned the influences from the gamer world, which may even be bigger. Those that drew their inspirations from Tolkien or a copy of Tolkien include such examples as D&D, Warhammer, Warcraft, Elder Scrolls, so on and so forth. I know I'm oversimplifying, but I hope you get my point. It's instinctual for us to be inspired by these stories and the worlds that we like, and these in turn will inform and influence our own worlds. Though we might go back to the old myths and legends, how many of us delve as deeply as Tolkien did? And how many of us just glean the good stuff from his masterworks without really understanding the underlying meaning? Yet what if we did dive that fully into myth and legend? I'm not going to do much here. There are far greater experts on YouTube. Just go ahead and Google what is a dwarf, what is an elf, so on and so forth, and a bunch will pop up that you can watch. But for purposes of this conversation, I'll give a streamlined version. Dwarves came to life as maggots in the body of the first giant, and then the gods gave them intelligence, though they still continued to live in the earth. They were short in stature and master craftsmen. That hasn't changed. Many shapeshifted into animals and, frankly, lived largely as animals. And at least one was turned into stone after being caught outside during the day. Not a troll, it was a dwarf. Elves are lesser supernatural beings who are mentioned a lot less in the Norse Eddas than dwarves were. Thus, their origins are a little more obscure, and honestly, this might be part of why elves are less consistently perceived in various fantasy works. But in the Eddas, there were two kinds. There were the light elves and there were the dark elves. The light elves were beautiful. They were capable of passing through solid objects, and some of them were also master craftsmen. The dark elves, also master craftsmen, lived beneath the earth. Does that sound familiar? Yep. There are some references that link dark elves and dwarves together as the same people, thereby suggesting that dwarves are a subset of elves. Here is another link between the two. Did you know that Gandalf actually translates to something along the lines of magical staff elf? He was a dwarf listed in the Eddas. Into the medieval and Renaissance periods, both groups continued to evolve. For example, the elves came to be associated with nature, fertility, the arts, and music, while the dwarves continued to be underground master craftsmen. Both were seen as capricious and as likely to hinder as help humans. They were highly magical and prone to mischief, such as spooking livestock, stealing food, causing diseases, or even abducting babies. Simply put, these mythical creatures were otherworldly rather than worldly, as portrayed by Tolkien and his successors. They did not have concerns about food supply, shelter, law, economics, or social structures. Even the laws of physics don't apply to them. Thus, they exist outside of the bounds of the natural order and have very little in common with any species that has to eke out survival in the world. So if you want fey creatures that live outside of the bounds of natural laws, you can draw very easily from the original source material. However, if you want humanoids with grounded cultures living alongside, or perhaps instead of, humans, then you've got a greater problem. You're stuck between a rock and a hard place. On the one side, we have copies of copies of copies of humanoid races that were initially rooted into a world by Tolkien, but have now, by repeated iteration, become walking cliches. On the other side, we have the original myths and legends that are largely unworkable in a plausible world. I mean, even Tolkien faced this challenge to some degree. Compare the otherworldly Tom Bombadil with the very worldly dwarves of the Lonely Mountain. So what can we do? I see three possible solutions to this dilemma. One, we justify the tropes. Two, we distinguish between racial, cultural, and individual traits. Three, we abandon using elves, dwarves, halflings, and the like altogether. We'll approach each one in turn and talk about their advantages and their disadvantages. Option one is to justify the tropes. This one appears to be the most straightforward one on the surface, but it may not actually be as easy as it looks. Simply, we lean into all of those cliches that say what a dwarf or an elf or a halfling or whatever happens to be. We've already covered quite a few aspects of what these are, but with the acceleration of these races' appearances in books, in movies, and games, the cliches have only intensified. Probably the biggest advantage to this method is you're building on that which is already familiar. These fantasy races keep appearing because they are so popular. In fact, some of them have such avid proponents that I've practically witnessed dwarf elf wars in our own world where dwarves and elves don't actually exist. By tapping into this energy, you are tapping into what people already love. One of the best recent examples I've seen of this is in the tabletop RPG book By This Axe, wherein the author carefully considered all of those tropes and cliches that make up the dwarves. And then he came up with real-world plausible justifications for why dwarves look and behave the way that they do. It is a must-have for any dwarvophile. So how do you manage to do something like this? Let's take a look at a few of the example cliches that I used when I started this video. First, how about an elf who would burn down the world to save his tree? Could an entire race truly consist of beings who behave that way? It seems like a stretch, right? But certain fantasy settings would have you believe that it's true. If this is a trope that you want to build on, then you need to explain why. It can't just be, I like trees. I mean, I like all sorts of things, but the degree to which elves defend trees and to our perceptions sometimes overreact to the threats to them for an entire species borders on the absurd. You have to explain why. So what if the elves of your world are more like undead monstrosities, where the trees are more like a phylactery for their souls? A phylactery, get it? So anyway, if the tree dies, the elf dies. Killing a tree isn't just tree murder, it is now elf murder. Make a society like that, and all of a sudden they have a very plausible and justifiable reason to not want their trees to be chopped down. So how about a dwarf who is constantly chugging beer and will get into a fight with anybody who looks at him halfway funny? Individually, sure, I can see that, but as an entire race, that seems a little implausible. But what if dwarves need the fibers of grain in their diet to survive, but they can't process it in solid form? The only way they can consume it is by distilling it. It's a little bit of a stretch, but have you ever studied koalas and the poisons that they have to eat to survive? It's not completely far-fetched, at least. And I will say I'm not a fan of the undead elf idea or the distilled grain dwarf idea. But the point here is merely to give examples of how you could take tropes and figure out true world justifications for those groups' behavior. It's a viable method if you take the work seriously. Admittedly, neither of my two examples were ones that I honestly took that seriously. But then, if you couldn't tell, this is not my preferred method. We'll get into that in a little bit. But this one does have its advantages, as we said. You're leaning into those things that make these races so popular and also so familiar. Nevertheless, I would say proceed with care. Leaning into something just because you want to stay faithful to tropes, especially if you're trying to do all of the tropes, can lead you into some really shaky ground. You can end up with the absurd and something very shallow if you're not careful. It may make all of your endeavors comedic. Now, if you're seeking to do something comedic, that's fine, such as Terry Pratchett's Discworld. But if you're wanting to create a serious world, one that has gravitas, and you find that this keeps backfiring on you and leaving you with something silly, then perhaps option one isn't the best choice for you. So the next option is to look at defining your fantasy races based upon racial, cultural, and individual traits. When we look at humans, we are all Homo sapiens. We are all of the same DNA, and that DNA is probably the best way to look at it. What is the DNA that makes humans humans versus the DNA that makes dwarves dwarves or the DNA that makes elves elves? It is something that is baked into how we are, that we cannot change, and that all of us have. So what is it that makes elves and dwarves unique on the DNA level? I think probably the main thing you're going to see here are physical attributes. For example, with dwarves, probably part of their racial DNA is the fact that they are short and maybe stocky, and that they have an extensive ability to grow beards, perhaps even among the women. With elves, one thing which would be in their DNA is the fact that they have pointy ears, for example. Or with halflings, it would be, for example, that they have hair on the top of their feet. But should racial traits also be behavioral attributes as well? This is where things get a little bit more shaky. And so I'll give it a strong maybe. The challenge is, of course, that we as humans are the only sapient race on Earth, so it's very hard for us to compare sapient behavior in another race when there only is one. But we can perhaps do this a little bit by looking at the animal kingdom. For example, there are animals who are herd animals, and they herd together as a means of defense. Or there are other animals who use the way in which they delve their burrows or guard their dens as a distinguishing characteristic of their physical attributes. I'm not sure that a beaver could be a very good herd animal, because how are beavers going to run away from a pack of wolves? They're not. They're going to dive under the water and go to their den where the wolf can't reach them. In the same way, how is a gazelle going to form a beaver den? They're not. Their legs, their bodies are built for speed, and so they behave accordingly. And so in this way, racial characteristics can define behaviors as well. So from this, I would posit that your various fantasy races can have different racial characteristics based upon how they organize their societies, how they care for their young, and how they interact with their environment based upon those physical attributes that define what they're capable of doing and not capable of doing. So as an example, let's actually look at halflings or hobbits, who, as all the tropes tell us, love to eat a lot and have many, many meals per day. So what if, for example, this is a racial characteristic baked into their DNA, wherein their bodies burn calories too quickly or can't store calories enough so that they have to constantly be eating? Well, the response to that would be that they would eat more meals. So you might say, hey, Jonathan, how is this any different than option one, where we are defining all those tropes and coming up with justifiable reasons for them? And on the racial level, it is no different. That's exactly what we're doing. The difference between option one and option two is that we don't have to put everything into that racial category. Some of those things that are tropes that define a way fantasy race functions are cultural or individual, rather than being broad stroke, everybody does it. So let's take the next step into culture. Every society is going to refine those basic racial characteristics in order to function more properly with their environment, with their traditions, so on and so forth. So for example, those human societies living in extremely arid regions, such as the steppes of Central Asia or the grasslands of North America, are typically going to become a nomadic culture where they wander around to meet their needs for food. Oftentimes they're going to maintain herds and or hunt those herds for a large part of their diet. The requirements of these kinds of cultures, this movement, this instability, tends to lead to more patriarchal societies, and it also can tend to lead to more warlike societies, as there is a much more tenuous margin of error for survival. Now, on the other hand, if you look at lush cultures, such as those that predominate in Europe or in China or in the eastern seaboard of the United States, those groups have the ability to grow their food much more easily than those in the steppe. And since they can grow their food, they can develop much more stable, long-term societies in one locale, which allows for such luxuries as a more cosmopolitan outlook on life, and also greater specialization of skills. This isn't to say that one group is better or worse than the other. They are both adapting to the needs of the environment around them. These are cultural developments based upon environment. And in fact, those cultural developments can change if the environment changes. A perfect example of this would be the Huns, who were a nomadic people, extremely warlike and patriarchal, who invaded Europe, among other places. And when they invaded Europe and they settled down and became a conqueror people in Europe, they quickly found that the nomadic lifestyle that they had become accustomed to on the steppes didn't work in the forested environment of Europe. They became agrarian. They established cities. And in the long term, if you look at the Huns, who eventually became the Hungarians, they are little different than those other cultures around them who did not have the same identical nomadic past. This is the power of environment on culture as defining how a species behaves. Now, there are, of course, many other things we haven't talked about. Like we could talk about tradition and other influences until you're way too tired of this video. But hopefully you get the point on how culture can define those traits as well. As we move on to the individual level of traits, I would like to go back to the examples we used in option 1 of our brawling, drunken dwarf. Odds are these fit best as individual characteristics. We've talked about how they might work otherwise already, but in the simplest way and oftentimes in the most rational way, making these individual may work best. A race which has drunkenness and perpetual brawling baked into its DNA is probably not going to be a very productive race. In fact, it may weaken itself to the point that it is wiped out by races that are more sober and self-controlled. And after all, when we look at dwarves, sure, there's a trope about dwarves drinking a lot. But there's also a trope about dwarves being master craftsmen and very hard workers. You can't be a hard-working master craftsman if you're 3 sheets to the wind all the time. But if we boil this down to an individual trait, then sure, much like in humans, we have your brawling barfly, which is just as much of an archetype for our species as the drunken brawling dwarf is for fantasy tropes. One of the great advantages here is that, as I've alluded to, you can toss out some of those stupider tropes that just don't make sense. We've been spending a lot of time looking at dwarves and elves, so let's veer into looking at halflings or hobbits, if you prefer, for this example. And the one here that really drives me nuts, and I think is just frankly stupid, is the idea that hobbits are great thieves. Where did this even come from? Well, to start with, hobbits are largely a creation of Tolkien. Sure, there are halflings that exist in legend and myth, but they're nothing like the modern halflings that we see today. Halfling back then generally meant someone who was very small, and that's it. So hobbits and modern halflings are a creation of Tolkien, and then the copy of the copy of the copy that came from it. And in that copy, somehow, they all turn into thieves. The only hobbit thief in the entire works of Tolkien is Bilbo. Nobody else. In fact, Bilbo himself didn't even know he was a good thief. Gandalf recognized it. There's a reason why Gandalf put the mark on Bilbo's door and not on the Sackville Bagginses or Hamfast Gamgees. He recognized the capacity in Bilbo to be a good adventurer and a good burglar. In fact, if you look at Hobbit society, everything points against them being good thieves. They are an extremely well-ordered, well-organized culture, broken into a shire with different farthings, with sheriffs in charge of different things. If they had been a bunch of anarchic thieves, then there is no way that Sharky, or Saruman, could have done what he did at the end of Lord of the Rings, or Frodo could have mustered the support that he needed to on such quick notice to deal with Sharky and Sharky's men at the end of that tale. That is a society that is built not on thievery, but the opposite thereof, on order and law. Yet for some reason, this trait has been doubled down on again and again and again until you get that most terrible, awful group called the Kinder of Dragonlance. And this group makes no sense whatsoever. There is no verisimilitude in how they're incorporated. We're told, oh, they're cute and everyone loves them because they're so adorable while they're robbing you blind. No! I hate to break it to you, but if there's a species that's robbing you blind, you don't put up with them just because they're cute. No, You probably exterminate them. I would provide a perfect example on the proper way that humans would deal with a species of this sort by looking at the original Star Trek episode, The Trouble with Tribbles. Yeah, the Tribbles were cute. They had these nice little humming things, but they ate the entire grain supply. And what did they do with those Tribbles? They got rid of them. They didn't pet them on the head and let themselves be starved to death because they were so adorable. Now, that just doesn't make any sense. So let's take a step back here as I calm down off my Kinder rampage and take a look at hobbits from a cultural perspective. So we have lambasted the idea that hobbits or halflings are thieves. That's an individual trait that belonged to Bilbo. A racial trait is, of course, that they're short and that they have lots of hair on the top of their feet. But how about cultural? Well, a perfect cultural example of the halflings or the hobbits is the fear of the water. Now, the hobbits in the Shire, it's well documented that they do not like the water. They're terrified of it. Yet we know from Tolkien that there is a second group who are very similar in their biology and their nature to the hobbits, and that was Smeagol's folk who lived along the rivers. And those people loved the water. Smeagol finds the One Ring because he's diving and isn't afraid of it. In fact, he enjoys it. So here's an example where you have two groups with the same basic DNA who, for various reasons, have come to different perspectives about how they view the water. We don't really know why the hobbits in the Shire fear the water, but the group to which Smeagol belongs lived alongside the water. They relied upon fishing for their survival, and so on and so forth. So one of the great advantages of this option is that you have a lot more freedom than in option one to develop and provide your own outlook on these fantasy races than if you were locked into just trying to make all of these tropes fit and apply to everyone. You can have the drunken dwarf, but you can also have the dwarf who likes to sit in the forest and paint birds, because you've figured out what those things are locked in racially, culturally, and individually. Now, the warning here is that you can take this possibility too far. If you go and you call a six-legged, four-armed, purple monstrosity an elf, I think you're probably going to lose everybody. Call it something else and you're okay. Call it an elf and you have completely turned your back on everything that makes an elf and turned it into something completely incomprehensible. As we come to the end of this option, I would actually posit that this is the path that Tolkien chose for himself. Now, obviously, Tolkien couldn't copy himself, as we've talked about copies of copies of copies. But what he did do is he looked back at the legends and the myths, which was what existed prior to him, and then he picked and chose those aspects that he liked, and he made some of them racial, some of them cultural, and some of them individual, while rejecting others entirely. His dwarves aren't shapeshifters. His dwarves don't turn to stone in the sun, but they are subterranean and they're master craftsmen. His elves aren't short. I think, honestly, that Tolkien is the first person to introduce tall elves. I could be wrong. If I am, I would love to hear the origins of that concept. But with the elves as a great example, he broke them into three cultural groups. You have the Vanyar, the Noldor, and the Teleri. And then, of course, within each of those, you have many individual characteristics that make his elves such strong personalities in his world. So perhaps you're tired of the tree-hugging elf or the drunken dwarf, and you just say, enough is enough, give me something unique. Well, option 3 might be the choice for you, and that is not to use elves or dwarves or halflings altogether. There's a large market, perhaps even a growing market share for those parts of the fantasy audience who are tired of the classic elves, dwarves, and halflings. If you look at some of the big names in the epic fantasy genre, you're going to see this trend. Perfect examples would be Robert Jordan, Brandon Sanderson, or George R.R. Martin, who don't have elves or dwarves or halflings or anything like them. They've rejected these races in preference to focusing on humans exclusively or almost exclusively. Sure, they may have some secondary races like Jordan has his Ogier, but they're really pushed to the side of the world and the side of his storytelling. Their roles have become quite small. The reason for this has already been stated. As George R.R. Martin said, elves have been done to death. I could have split this option in half, though. After all, there's actually two ways of removing elves and dwarves from your fantasy setting. One is, as I've mentioned, to focus on humans and different human cultures for your interesting differences and interchanges. The other is to establish fantasy races that are all your own and aren't drawn from those classic tropes. Stephen Erickson and his Malazan Book of the Fallen is a great example of this. He has his skeletal Tlan Imas, his tusked Jeghut, the highly articulated Forkrul Asael, and the reptilian Kachain Shamal, and so on. Now, I may have mangled the pronunciations of that. I'm sorry if I did, but hopefully you get the point. What about the Tisti, you may ask? We'll get to that in a little bit, but the point here is that he has created interesting fantasy races far removed from those traditional tropes. This does have a disadvantage, though, and that is by introducing something new and foreign, you may be making it harder for your audience to digest. There is a reason we love elves, after all, and I guess that some people love dwarves and halflings. So if you decide to follow this route, I have two tips for you. The first is to make sure that you explain and describe these races sufficiently that your audience can visualize and relate to them. As I said, Erickson is brilliant in his introduction of really interesting fantasy races, but where he falls short, unfortunately, is in how he explains and introduces them to his readers. They're oftentimes baffling and a little confusing for a long time after their first introduction. And I confess I've had a hard time visualizing them for quite a few books after I first encountered them. Indeed, I would say that a good rule for how to handle these races is to approach them in their introduction the same way you would begin your first time telling a story from a particular character's point of view. As luck would have it, I just recently did a video on point of view, and in fact, the third tip of that talks specifically about this problem and offers some solutions to it. The second tip is to be careful about how strange you make your fantastical races. There's a reason why all the classic ones are humanoids, for example. We can relate to something with 2 eyes, 2 arms, 2 legs. But if your fantasy race is a 6-legged, 3-armed purple monstrosity that is chitinous, asexual, eats carbon dioxide, and lays eggs to reproduce, your audience will probably have a hard time relating to them. Such a creature will probably end up being too foreign and incomprehensible. But we're not done. I have a fourth surprise option, and that one I've sort of hinted at all along, and it is the hybrid method. This is taking option 1 and 2, or 2 and 3, or perhaps all 3, and combining them together for the most preferable outcome. This is where Stephen Erickson's Tiste come in. They are the elves of his world, complete with the classic light, shadow, and dark versions, though each with their own unique takes on them, oftentimes which clash with the classic tropes. And that's kind of the point here. Why would somebody go to Erickson and say, that Tiste is not an elf? Well, he'd respond, of course it's not an elf, it's a Tiste. It's elf-like, but it's not an elf. And that's the power of the hybrid model. And in fact, the reason I made the choice that I did, I chose this method. The main race alongside humans in Tears from Iron are the Siristari. And they are elf-like, but they are not elves. And by following that model, I was able to pick various aspects and clichés of the elf that I liked and develop those further, but I did not feel bound to make them completely comport with Tolkien's elves or Warhammer's elves or the elves of myth and legend. They are Siristari. They are something unique and something different, but also something familiar. So that brings us to the end of this discussion. We started by looking at the cliché-heavy legacy that emerged from copies of Tolkien's master works. We then took a brief look at what the myths and legends say about elves and dwarves and saw how otherworldly rather than worldly they are, which led us to the rock and a hard place of how do we incorporate elves and dwarves into our stories while being not a copy of a copy of a copy cliché, but also to be a natural part of those worlds that we are trying to construct. And that led us to our 3 solutions, or is it 4? The first is to justify the tropes. This is to lean into all those things that those copies have said an elf, a dwarf is, and finding plausible justifications for that. The second is to delineate your racial, cultural, and individual traits and break those tropes up into those different 3 levels, and potentially rejecting the ones that you don't like. The third option is to reject elves, dwarves, halflings, and so on altogether. You can do this one of 2 ways. You can have an exclusively human or nearly exclusively human world where those cultures are sufficient to tell kinds of stories that you want to tell. Or you can introduce your own fantasy races that are uniquely different from the classics. And then, of course, our fourth option is the hybrid, where you combine various aspects of these, such as making races that are elf-like or dwarf-like, but aren't called by that name and are allowed their own unique space while drawing upon some of the tropes, but otherwise being your own creation. This makes them more familiar while also allowing you greater latitude to take a unique path. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed this discussion and found it enlightening and helpful. If you did, please like and subscribe for more content. If you have any thoughts on your own solutions or your own soapboxes, such as mine about the Kinder or the thieving hobbits, please put those in the comments below. I'd love to read them. If you're interested in my own world building and the paths that I take, along with subscribing to this channel, feel free to check out my Substack, where I dive deeper into how I create my own fantasy world. And of course, if you'd like to see it all put together, check out my novel, Tears from Iron. It's available in paperback, on Kindle, and in audiobook, all linked below. And my next novel is targeted to roll out later this year. So until next time, have a good day.